Welcome to Busybody. I'm Cadence, and I'm here today with Caroline Contillo, who is a client, a friend, I would say, and a sometimes climate activist, these are her words, and a disaster equity researcher. And I wanted to have her on because I feel like what she is often discussing and researching and talking about is she is really at the intersection of things that are in the news, things that are stressful for us, that are affecting our bodies as individuals. And I feel like Caroline really has a wonderful perspective on how that is affecting us actually in our bodies and in the environment that is larger than us. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to get into this.
Can you tell me how you started in this? Because even what we were just talking about, you were saying how people tend to choose kind of either working on the individual or working on the system. And I immediately was thinking about like so many books that I've read about communication tactics and like healing modalities where the person was kind of studying something very externalized and then suddenly realized that like they themselves had all these dynamics happening, you know, within their families or within their own bodies. And that shifted their research. So can you tell us how you got started in this?
Yeah, totally. So when I was an undergrad at Hunter College, I took a class it was called The History and Science of Global Warming. It just, like, I was shocked. I hadn't heard about this thing before. This was 2008. So I think it was like right after Inconvenient Truth came out. And I just became sort of obsessed with the fact that, okay, there's this huge systemic problem that's going to touch every aspect of our lives and is already doing that in some places of the world. What are we doing about this? And kind of took two different paths for dealing with that. One, I pursued meditation, which I feel was kind of like me dealing with myself as an individual. Yeah. Like, how do I as an individual handle this information and the despair that it's bringing up? And then I also started doing some climate justice activism. And these felt like it was hard to meet the two. I had my way of dealing with it as an individual. Then there was this systemic way. But it felt like I sort of had to flip-flop between the two. And like, it was very hard to meet them, which I now understand as like a product of living in a very individualistic culture. It makes it difficult for us to link our individual experiences of things to that systemic analysis, almost by design.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah.
What happened more recently? Because you just went into your whole PhD program or your master's program, that like what happened to really catalyze your deep study?
Yeah. So I would say that I at the beginning of the pandemic, sort of that surge of adrenaline and fear, a lot of anxiety, both about the pandemic and then the uprisings for Black lives, feeling that there was sort of an opening, like an opportunity. People are starting to think about what could be a more just and livable world. So I found this program that was a dual degree program through Tulane University, social work with a focus on collective trauma, and a second degree, master's degree in disaster resilience. And that was sort of the first time that I was super intense. I was like, oh, this is an intense situation. What could I do to make it more intense? Which we can also talk about.
Incredible.
Like, some of my own survival strategy background that may have led me to that decision. But the program was really the first place where I was able to really take those threads of like individual experience and trauma and systemic analysis and really start to put those together for the first time. So that was, it was very intense work. I was also, my internship was at a crisis intervention hotline. Wow. So it was, I feel like I will for the rest of my life be processing just that program alone.
Yeah.
But like lots of lessons, lots of, it was like a really fruitful time for me to be able to sort through my own experience and like what I could contribute.
Can you speak to kind of placing the individual or like the awakening of how hard it is to process both being an individual and being part of a system and existing in that system and trying to change that system, because the individualism that you started to realize or process as you've been through this study, I think that's like constantly what we're coming up against. And I see it in my own work, like how do I help? But I'm also like living under the same systems. Like how am I contributing? How am I just like taking part in the same problem? Can you speak more about that?
Yeah. And I'll shout out a group called Relational Uprising, because I've done some work with them and they have a really great way of presenting this in an accessible way. I took their training specifically because they were sort of like, okay, why as activists who want a better, more just, more livable world, do we get together and kind of take out all of our trauma on each other and make the work harder than it could be? And so they were in good faith asking that question, trying to unpack that. And it really came down to individualism, that we have our own traumas from our family systems, from these larger systems of oppression, and we're left to deal with them on our own. That's how Western psychology operates. That's how capitalism really conceives of us as these discrete individuals with few needs and high productivity, et cetera. And we, even if we are like against that, we have internalized that into our tissues and we embody that and act it out. So it can't just be that we have this desire to change things. It's important to have that. Then every activist I know and every change maker I know has this passion for change and knows that things aren't right. But if we don't also include the body in that conversation and that work, we might be continuing to perpetuate some of the same systems that are creating the harm. So that's...
Sure. It kind of reminds me of, I'm always really disturbed by Gloria Steinem's super, super thinness. And like, apparently she just drinks Tab and has like an empty fridge. And I'm just like,
yeah. And like, it's like she has internalized the same system that she is trying to work against. And I think there's an element of like giving ourselves grace for the ways that we continue to embody those systems, but also like recognizing, I think that I feel like it importantly comes up in the self-care conversation too, because like as somebody who's operated in climate justice circles, you definitely come across fellow activists who are just like, well, self-care, caring about yourself, that's individualistic. So I'm going to skip that. And then it's like, we are burning ourselves out and being horrible to each other in activist spaces because we're just like on principle skipping self-care.
Right.
So it's a little bit more of a both and. It's like, yes, community care is like a thing that we all need to start factoring into the work. But that doesn't mean, once again, it doesn't mean just flipping over to only that. It's like a both and. We still need to find ways to take care of ourselves for the benefit of doing that work.
So for the average person who's like skimming the news because they don't want to get, lie awake at night worrying about these things, what would you say to help them kind of locate themselves? Because I think that's a place where I have a lot of sadness, is sort of like interacting with people that I feel like, oh, it's so overwhelming. And it immediately makes you disassociate out of your own body, disassociate out of like how you're fitting into any of this, that you're just not taking any action at all. And like, so I'll see you on our floating plastic island, in 20 years and be like, I really wish you'd read the news.
Yeah. Yes. That super, super resonates. I think, and I learned this through climate work, because I would flip between like being super immersed in it and keeping up on every little, like climate benchmark that had been passed, and I would get really overwhelmed, and then I would completely check out and not follow it for like 6 months. And to make the work more sustainable, I had to start thinking about what could my interaction with this information teach me about my own survival strategies and how I manage stress? That was like a really generative way to say, can I let a little bit of this in and really look at what is my tendency? Like some people are going to tend more towards dissociation. Some people might tend more towards fight, flight. It's like we have all of these strategies for managing unmanageable terror, basically. And what I learned was that like I had a certain sort of template for stress management that I had learned as a young person. And it wasn't super helpful in the present. So it's so funny how sticking with the same thing for like almost 40 years just does not actually work.
Weird that me at 8 didn't know how to do things so great.
Right. And like compassion for 8-year-old me for like the things that she had to do to manage stress. But yeah, what of that can I kind of let go of in the present and learn from so that I can engage with the news in general in a way that becomes an invitation to act on what I care about rather than something that's overwhelming me so much that I'm just like, I can't handle this.
Since all of this is so abstract, can you give an example of like what's a news information? Like, how would you put that in action? What does that look like?
Yeah, so it might look like, I have a journaling practice. So it might look like when I'm journaling, and my journaling practice, I just like to write down, a little bit of what I did that day. If I notice that I lost 4 hours to like I am doing professional disaster research right now, so that complicates it a little bit. But like in my pleasure time, if I'm really falling down those like compulsive news consumption wormholes, just being mindful of that and like being compassionate to myself again, like that's honor my nervous system for the way that is in some way trying to protect me from something that is existentially horrifying. Notice if I can dial it down. I have some agency in dialing it down. Can I dial it down to the point that it feels digestible, which might mean taking in one story that day and then also sitting and noticing what is that? Where do I feel that in my body? Like when I take in that, when I really allow myself to face what that makes me feel, where do I feel that? And then I think the next step is, can I do something expressive with that? Like I started to notice, I felt a lot of my climate anxiety when I would read these stories in my hands. Like I would just get jittery hands. So I picked up guitar because I was like, this is a use for anxious, jittery hands. I went to a workshop last night, it was on Zoom. That counts as went to. I went to a workshop last night that was a climate emotions comic artist who makes little comics. And she taught us how to just do like a 1-page comic with whatever you're feeling. So I think
that's so fun.
Yeah. And then sharing it, because we are not meant to metabolize this amount of stress by ourselves. Oh, and movement. I mean, like that's really relevant to like our work together. Like the expressiveness could be movement, like noticing this emotion, like emotion. I'm having an emotion about this. It's meant to move through me. What sort of movement could I do to help that move? And that last piece is that connection, like share the comic. Did you write a song? Could you share it with people? Because I feel like that connection piece speaks to that need for like collective, like shouldering the burden together.
That's the resilience. Yeah. The connection for sure.
Totally.
I love that too, because it reminds me of something that an old therapist of mine said like a million years ago that I think about a lot and I share with people a lot, where he said that his therapist always asks, what emotion are you trying not to have right now?
Ooh.
And I think about that because I really consider stress to be like a solid object. And I feel like we kind of talk about it like you can just be like, I'm stressed and like, now I'm not stressed or whatever. But you're always literally managing the thing of stress. Like it's a sphere that you're like walking around with holding. You can put it down, you can put it over there. Whatever you're doing, you are in relationship to it. And so the idea of like reading a story that's upsetting and then actually sitting, instead of trying to push away the feelings that come up, which often are really huge feelings like grief. Like a lot of times I read stories, I try, the ones that always super upset me are like some other creature that's now, extinct or something, or like a butterfly that they could have saved, but we raised that part of the forest and now we'll never know. And like, if I really sit with that, it's a horrible morning, just like a terrible, humongous morning. But to not sit with that is immediate stress, because now I'm actively pushing it away. And it's like a thing that I'm pretending is not there all day, and it is there. But to sit with it, feel it. And then I love you take the next step, which is very healthy. Then you actually move with it, like create something or be physical, like shift it out of you, do something with that. I think often people discount the last part, the processing it out or kind of turning it creative, because we also so devalue kind of levity in this culture. Like we just devalue joy and fun and things that are like, it seems silly, like I just posted yesterday a video to do shaking movement when you're stressed. And I share that with clients all the time. And the first response is always that people feel silly. And I'm like, right, but now you're not having a panic attack. I'd rather feel silly than panicked. But silly is like, seems worse for some reason. Panic seems like I'm doing something. And I think that's also like a huge thread of this there's like almost an addictive quality to the stress. Like the stress is an action, but it's really not.
Yeah. And I think there's this sense that like, if it's kind of silly or there's levity, it's light, it couldn't possibly be healing. Like It has to feel really grueling. Which, when I'm in that spiral of just scrolling through horrible story after horrible story, it has the effect of almost feeling like an action, like I am doing something.
Sure.
So needing to have some capacity to step away from that, and that like externalizing and expressing piece, so that it's not so it doesn't feel like the entirety of my experience, which grief can feel like. And I feel like it makes it, people talk about how healing it is to just go out and be in nature. But I try to be mindful of the fact that for a lot of people, going out and being in nature right now means confronting loss, means confronting this place has changed in like irreversible ways. So there's a lot of grief there. And grief is just another one of those things that we're not meant to have to handle by ourselves. And if we're going to be able to connect with the natural world, it's an important part of how we address climate change, because our disconnection from it, our imagined disconnection, because we are inherently part of it, that is part of that individualism. And that is part of like the circumstances that created climate change. So healing from that, there's a lot to be gained from that. But I think the obstacle is like, it's it's really painful.
Yeah. And I like my own anxiety is always just that, as we continue forwards, as time moves forwards, I'm just kind of overwhelmed with the idea that there is just going to be so much more loss and grief. And I'm always, that's something that I'm thinking about often, like my own aging process. What is that going to look like in a world that's, to me, seems like it's going to get smaller and smaller, which is like not at all how people before us were seeing their retirements and things like that. My assumption is things will just get harder for us in small ways, like lettuce will be $35 or something like that, like small ways and big ways.
Yeah, totally.
And can you speak a bit about the somatic work you're doing and kind of how that's fitting into everything? Because that is obviously like where I locate myself in this, in terms of like any value that I have to our culture moving forwards in this is that's my only hope, that in the future when the banks collapse, I'll be able to just help people physically. And I'm going to learn to sew. That's what I've decided. I'm going to
Yeah, that is an important reskilling for sure. Somatics, which I have studied in the lineage of Stacey K. Haynes. She has a great book called The Politics of Trauma. But it's a whole field, and I think somatics, the term, comes from the Greek soma, like of the body. So it's really any of these modalities that are like remembering the connection between mind and body, because it's not creating it. It's like that connection is there. It's just taking it into account. Those practices and my study of that has just been so incredible for being able to work with my own trauma background in a way that relates me to other people. It's very much about being able to reconnect with people, with place, with the natural world. Knowing that, we might again, like have these templates of how we manage stress and trauma that were forged in previous experiences that we might unknowingly be bringing to our relationships now. And how to work with that at the level of the body. So it is a healing, it is like a healing modality. It's also an expressive modality, and it's like the place I see for it in climate work again is that like so many people come to climate work, myself included, just being really freaked out and really just like, oh my God, we have to act on this right now. And coming from that really activated, like possibly very dysregulated place where my experience has been that we're all just kind of freaking each other out. And this idea of like slowing down and coming back into relationship. Like when I hear you talk about how like things are going to be harder in the future, it's like, yes, I don't imagine it's going to suddenly get like easier to be on planet Earth anytime soon. So what can we do to make things, not necessarily easier, but like that we can share that burden together and it's more distributed, is learn how to be in relationship to each other. And I think another person who I would credit with learning about this from, who is also a somatics person, is Adrienne Marie Brown, who has a great book, Emergent Strategy. But yeah, it's like being in relationship is going to be the most important thing going forward. Like having your individualistic doomsday prep plan. It's like, for what? For what? Like truly trying to just exist as an individual in a basement bunker. Like what a hell realm.
Enjoy that.
But yeah, bringing our bodies back into the equation, and our bodies, which are naturally in relationship to the land and nature and other beings, and each other, and starting to heal the ways that we relate to each other. I think that is really going to be one of the most important things going forward.
Is that a thread that is becoming more widespread in climate activism? I'm not in any kind of activism kind of community per se. So is that something that's being discussed more? Because I definitely feel like with my work, if I could really distill what I'm trying to do with people, it's basically to get people engaged with the body that they have personally, not a distant body, not an aspiring body, but the body that they are currently inhabiting. And my hope is that when people are really engaged with and embodying the actual body that they actually have, suddenly all this power, all this resiliency, all of this possibility it's just kind of like the door opens, because it was always there. But we spend so much time, kind of like the stress thing, we spend so much time pushing away a lot of aspects of ourselves and the body that we currently are living in because of all of the things, the trauma and the family background and society. So if we can really inhabit it, suddenly you're like located and you have all this strength that has always been there this entire time, just kind of untapped. And I could really imagine kind of a sea change happening at some point where society as a whole realizes that we do have to really heal ourselves at this very individual body level to then basically undo that individualism. Is that something that's being discussed more widely, or is that just kind of in your study here?
Yeah, I mean, I have definitely noticed it becoming more and more part of the discussion in various types of movement work. Like I do climate justice movement work, but I know that in the movement for Black Lives, there's a practice of healing justice. So the healing justice movement, I would give credit to kind of really opening up this conversation. And so other movements, I think, are starting to look to that and say, oh, yeah, like, I don't know, like sometimes you see on social media, people are just like, oh, after the revolution, like we don't need therapy, we need revolution. And I'm like, do you realize that like after the revolution happens, like how much therapy everyone's going to need? Like there's so much, like not to say that therapy is the only way to do it, but just to say that healing, processing, healing, support, like I think sometimes we have to suppress how traumatizing the current system is to like get by, but bringing that healing into any movement work is so important. And I do feel like people are starting to open up to that. Like that's just people are starting to consider that part of the work.
That's very exciting. What would you like to leave us with? What's something that people could, for kind of somebody who, because I think really everybody does, I mean, not everyone, but the average person does care about climate change, but just really doesn't know how to engage, I think. Besides like, I recycle, and you're like, okay.
Yes. I mean, that's what the research shows. Like research shows people care, people are aware, people care, and people just feel so overwhelmed by it and don't know how to engage. In the times that I have done more activism, my motivating question always was like, okay, well, how do we make action available to people? Now I'm a little bit more on the side of, and what I would like to leave people with is just being as gentle as possible with yourself about this topic. And any overwhelming topic, honestly. We are not designed to be able to take in something that is so systemic and so huge and so existential. So expecting yourself to be able to sit with that on your own, like that is unreasonable. So be reasonable and kind to yourself in like, you're not a bad person for finding this overwhelming. And it makes sense that you would want to like deny and suppress this to get by. That totally makes sense. And in that gentleness, can you invite yourself to do any of the things that we mentioned today already? Do a little bit of movement, do a little bit of like, make a comic, whatever, and find that to be enough for that day. Because a lot of people aren't even able to do that. So don't feel like you have to solve climate change to be able to engage with it. Like that's, don't do that to yourself.
Point, because it's like, again, we live in such a culture that we're supposed to fix everything as individuals. And so we've been told we're supposed to be recycling, we're supposed to be biking instead of driving our cars, we're supposed to be doing all these things. Like myself, I'm gonna solve, the oil companies from exploding gas pipelines all over the place or whatever. But what you're really saying is if you can just start with like a little morsel, if you can just start to engage in a digestible way, you're going to build your own path into it, whatever that looks like. You might end up being someone who chains herself to a fence somewhere, or you might just be someone who like organizes a neighborhood composting thing or whatever, because you've started to find these like slow little inroads that help you make this a little bit more manageable.
100%. Yep. That's absolutely it.
Cool. Thank you so much, Caroline. We've been talking about this forever, and it's so nice to have you on. I hope to have you on again as your studies continue and as climate change continues to unfold.
as it will, for sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.